Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So today we're going to look at practice on this podcast for everyone who's interested in the body as more than just a brain taxi. So we're going to look at today is what is a practice, looking at your own practice, examining that, what makes a good practice, things to be careful of during a practice, resistances. We're going to look at examples of various practices, particularly the idea of a transformational practice. So hello, once again, it's evening time. Late at night, actually, almost in Brighton. I'm recording on a wet night in my little office here. So, why don't we start with something a bit different today? Let's start with a poem by Portia Nelson. 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm hopeless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. 2. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but this isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. 3. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. 5. I walk down another street. So I like that poem. I sometimes put that in my trainings. There's a lot there about personal responsibility. In a way, a practice is where we take responsibility, not just for our lives, but for ourselves. We say, who is the person I want to become and what would build that? That's kind of key here. What would build not just specific skills, but the kind of person that I want to be. And actually take, not just in Portia Nelson's poem where there's like avoiding something bad, but actually building something good. What she points to there, though, is the power of habit as well. So why do we need a practice? Why do we need a practice? Well, we have habits, right? And we have a particular way of being, which has been built by the circumstances of our life, our culture, our family of origin, etc., etc., etc. And most people will live their lives as victims of that, playing out particular patterns there. And they will say, yeah, this is just me. This is who I am. However, character can be developed. I like this word character. It's kind of old-fashioned almost, but it's something fairly long-term, but not exactly permanent, like the word personality. And this can be built. People used to talk about character building in times gone by. Yeah. Let's have another look at this. I mean, let me take a step back. Where have I got this information from? Why have I become interested in practice? Well, I'm a long-term practitioner of several arts, particularly Aikido and meditation, but various other arts like yoga and dance for some years, Aikido for over 20 years now. And what I realized doing transformational work with others is that people needed practice, or else, they do something, have a strong state experience. Maybe they, go to a workshop and jump up and down, sort of Tony Robbins type style, get kind of high, or get, very deep or very peaceful on a retreat, but then go home and the same stuff would happen. I definitely would notice this in myself. So the key to build kind of rewiring your brain, the neurons that are fired together, that have wired together, that you need to wire together differently, this kind of neuroscientific basis for this, is that we need to do something repeatedly, recurrently is probably a better word, in order to wire ourselves differently. So that when something happens, instead of going to a reactive habit, we've actually practiced something else and we can respond more skillfully, more kindly, more intelligently, more whatever it is. As I said, work-wise, I've been obsessed with this, working with students a lot. People that turn me on to this, people like Richard Strozzi Heckler, he's written a lot about this. I was just looking at his book, The Leadership Dojo, well worth a look. Ginny Whitelaw is another embodiment teacher who writes beautifully about this. Wendy Palmer, George Leonard, his books are well worth looking at around this subject. He had a book called Mastery that we often give out to our students on our courses. It's just a little book, easily readable. And that will tell you a lot about the idea of practice. Also, my colleague Francis Briers, so someone sort of more of my generation, Frankie wrote a book called The Little Book of Finding Your Way. That's another one I'd recommend on Amazon, like a quick and easy but yet deep read. Yeah. Here's a quote from George Leonard from Mastery. To practice regularly, even when you seem to be getting nowhere, might at first seem onerous, but the day eventually comes when practicing becomes a treasured part of life. Ultimately, practice is the path of mastery. If you stay in it for long enough, you'll find it to be a vivid place with its ups and downs, its challenges and discomforts, its surprises, disappointments, and unconditional joys. That's from Mastery. And he tracked how practice develops often through plateaus and periods of sort of gaining skill. And it's not totally random what we see with a practice. There's a course we run called the Embodied Facilitator course. You can find that on embodiedfacilitator.com. And on that course, every year people pick a practice. We run it in England, we run it in Russia. They spend about 2 months working with themselves and with us and with a coach and with a peer group to develop what that practice is. And they all pick different things based on what they need. And then they do that practice for 6 months for the rest of the course, and just over 6 months actually. And that's enough time for us to see fairly consistent patterns, some of the things that I'm going to go into now. Okay, so we need a long-term practice if we're going to grow as people. Much as the idea of the quick win is in our culture, the idea that we have a sudden insight. Yes, insight can come suddenly, but change comes slowly. We've done the seminars, guys. We all know this. This is the sort of, in a way, it's the bad news. But when I tell this to people on courses, most of the people come on my courses are experienced, and they go, yeah, that's right. They get it. They get that it's not about the quick insight, the breakthrough moment. That can be a good start to open something out, but it's not really about state. It's about developing habits, developing skills, developing ourselves as a person. Anyway, we're always practicing, right? So this is more about conscious practice. So this is another thing Strozzi says, that we're always practicing something. Like right now, as you're sitting or walking or standing, as you're listening to this podcast, what are you practicing? What are you practicing in your body, your embodiment, how you stand, how you breathe? What are you practicing in how you pay attention? There's a whole bunch of ways in which you're patterning yourself. You're becoming more permanent. Certain patterns are becoming more likely. Certain possibilities are becoming less likely. And that is happening all the time unconsciously. Though I'd use the term practice I reserve the term practice for consciously practicing. Building the self. So transformational practice is what we're talking about here. What could you do for that? Well, actually anything. Frankie talks about accountancy as a practice, or I've certainly heard about people talk about parenting as a practice. I've often give corporate clients how they walk to work. They might have like a 10-minute walk between, say, a subway station and their office, and that becomes their daily practice. So it can be, very day-to-day things. We'll come across in a little bit about some of the problems of making day-to-day things a practice, but it certainly can be anything. There are certain conditions, though, about what I'd say counts as practice. On AFC, we're actually quite strict with this with students. We'll say, look, you have to do so many hours a week. I think it's 3 or 4 hours a week. And it has to count these criteria, because over the years people would try and sort of squeeze all sorts of things in and be like, oh, that isn't really practice. So we ended up getting quite clear about the rules, as it were, like what counts. So first of all, it has to be intentional, and I'd say it has to be dedicated. So it's not, you can have what's called blended practice, or practicing in life, but there we're looking more at application. In application, that's what you practice for, perhaps, but it's not the practice itself. The reason being, it matters too much. Yeah. So in application, there are consequences to getting things wrong. The difference between a fight and being in a martial arts dojo, the difference between doing a communication exercise and sort of, a critical conversation with your wife. This is why we need a container for practice. Yeah. It needs to be a dedicated space, not sort of on the side while we're doing something else. Someone will be like, oh, I'm kind of walking to work. And I'm like, yeah, you can be aware while you're walking to work. I get that. It's better than none. For some of my corporate clients, that, might be the best they can do. But even better is to have a space this is the only thing I'm doing. It has an aim. It has an aim. So this is the purpose of my practice. And this sometimes is missing when I talk to yogis or aikidoka. I say, why are you in this class? Why have you come? And they won't know. And I find that quite strange. It's like, well, what are you trying to build? There's different things we can work on here, but it's useful to have some sense of direction. Frank is keen on ritualized practice. So Francis Briers, that is again, the idea that practice needs to be ritualized, and this doesn't need to be, some kind of shamanic thing. It could just be a specific beginning and end, putting your hands together or something like that. I like that in terms of the container that it creates. The other thing with a container is something controllable in there that you can say to someone in karate class, don't punch me so quickly, I'm still working on this block. Whereas, street fight, that's not going to happen. You can't tell your kids to be 20% less annoying. I would certainly add reflection as one of the key things. If you think of a learning cycle of practice, then having a reflective period after the action could be helpful. That's often missing from some things. So again, you could go quite unconsciously to a yoga or a martial arts class without actually treating it intentionally, having an aim, and then reflecting upon it afterwards. Two things I'd like to add, which aren't necessary for the definition of a practice, but they're hell of a helpful. One is the place. So you listen to the podcast with Adrian Harris on place, the power of place. That's absolutely a key part of embodiment. A beautiful dojo to practice in, or I was just dancing on Wednesday night in this 1,000-year-old church, and the place makes such a difference to everyone going deeper in that practice. I actually got so used to it that when I started dancing in a 5 rhythms, which is like a conscious dance practice, when I started dancing in a sports centre a few times when I was up in London, it just felt horrible. It's just completely different than this wonderful supportive container, literally in that sense here of a building. But then we've also got the community. So can you practice on your own? Yes, but being part of a community of practice is massive. That has all sorts of benefits. You're practically helping you with the practice, but it's also just being around them. I notice when I meditate in community, I can go much deeper, sit for longer, have better insights, etc., etc. And the side benefits, just being in a place with people who have decided to work on themselves, I think is very helpful. Very helpful to be in a place surrounded by other people who have said, yeah, I'm going to improve my life in some small way by coming here and doing this thing, even if the thing were like playing tiddlywinks or the art of putting up shelves, but if they were using that saying, right, this is what I want to make yourself a better person with this. And it could be, you could use that. For me, certainly things that involve a degree of intensity can be very helpful for a practice. So martial arts, partner dance can certainly have that, if it's just asking a pretty person to dance or feeling nervous about the steps, theatre can definitely have that. Improv can have that. So a degree, extreme sports, obviously, a degree of intensity I find very helpful. And a social element I find very helpful as well. Just doing something on your own, you're going to miss a lot in terms of what the practice build, but again, it depends what you're trying to build. So we've got this key idea here. I fleshed this out in my book on Embodied Yoga Principles, container versus transfer. So you need a container, and a container is a place that's safer, that has rules, that has limitations. There's certain things you do and don't do. So, for example, in a yoga class, you don't normally sort of chat and have a conversation. You don't necessarily, the sort of sexual side of life might be reduced, like flirting with people. There's limitations there on what you can do. The problem also is that let's call it a tension, that the transfer to life might happen less readily if the container's too strict, too different from life. And if it's too similar to life, well, then you haven't got the safety, you haven't got the ability to control the variables, you haven't got the necessary conditions for a practice to really develop yourself. So that's kind of a key tension here. Practice can be something very dedicated, like going to an Aikido club. It could be a little micro practice, something you just do for a minute. Wendy Palmer Sensei is very keen on 1 minute centering 5 times a day, for example. And I can see the benefit of that, of just like these little micro practices you can slip in. I often give people very brief embodied yoga principles postures. So it's like 1 posture or 3 postures, 1 minute a day each. 3 minutes for that. You can blend practices with other things, particularly if someone's already doing something. This is quite nice. So, I've done Aikido for years, and I bring other things into that around, say, postural practice or awareness practice. And what I'm working on in Aikido changes over the years. The key thing though is to have a clear aim, a clear commitment. I think commitment's a big part of this, linking it to values, staying in that sweet spot, the learning zone, right? So not too boring, not traumatizing, obviously, staying in that learning zone, preferably getting some feedback as well. So there's something measurable, something you can see grow, and getting feedback on that. Okay, there's a lot there. So let's have a brief reflection for a moment in terms of your own practice. If you have one, if you don't, we'll look at this later on. Which of those conditions are met? What are the actual practices in your life? So the things that you deliberately make space and time for, that are dedicated, perhaps ritualized, that have a clear intention, hopefully some sort of a beautiful place, even if it's just a corner of your front room to meditate, or a place you go to do it, a special place in some ways. How's that? How is that in your life? Where do you have this? And don't blag it. Don't be like, oh, that's kind of a practice, when it's really an application. Remember, that's different. Okay, so what are you trying to build? That's the key question here. Yeah, we'll come back to that later on. So let me give some examples from my own life and from students I've worked with. This will kind of flesh out the idea through some examples, some ideas of practice. So Aikido, I've mentioned, I intuitively chose Aikido when I walked it as a sort of alcoholic, chaotic, unhappy, depressed young man going into an Aikido dojo, 18 years old, into the University Aikido Club, and going, wow, just intuitively, it's like it chose me. And that's often the way with our kind of first love. It chose me. And as someone who's quite chaotic, and I didn't know this at the time, but looking back on it, I can see that now. It took me a couple of years, I think, to really realise this. The order that was there, the structure, everyone lined up in rows and uniforms, the order in an Aikido club really deeply appealed to me as someone that was kind of in psychological and emotional chaos and needed that order. So I can think of it as a practice of order. I mean, you know, I was learning a martial art. There's various practical reasons why that was. I was living in quite a dangerous neighbourhood. I was involved in crime, and it was like, you know, actually it was practically helpful to learn a martial art. That was on the surface, but intuitively I think I'd picked it to develop that capability of order, structure, spine, dignity. And the thing with Aikido is I've gone off and on and off over the years, but more on, and, you know, some intense periods. And I realized that it was a practice to develop my ethics, my way of being in the world. And it's changed, you know, for a long period of time. Aikido is a creativity practice for me. As I got better at Aikido, my Aikido got more creative and it became play practice. Maybe it's not the one you'd pick for that. This really shows a key idea here that different things all things can be practices in a way, right? Certainly, you know, dance, martial arts, yoga, etc. However, certain things are going to fit better for others. So on EFC, when students first say, this is what I want to develop, and then they look at options, and they have to like the teacher and the place, you know, we'll come to all that. But it's the key thing is, what are they trying to develop? That's always the question I ask them, rather than starting out with something. Yes, you can have this intuitive. Often people have this kind of first love of practice. The problem there, the danger, should we say, is just you get deeper and deeper into one thing. You end up massively overcompensating, sometimes just deepening a neurosis, really. So you've got to be a bit careful with that. And I'm a big fan of the idea of consciously choosing practices and a degree of cross-training, if you will. Yeah. So what I realized after doing Aikido for some years is that I was developed in certain ways, but not in others. So I wasn't very emotionally developed. And I started looking at non-violent communication, which has its pros and cons as a system of looking at needs and feelings and making requests. It's a good system. It's worth looking at. It's definitely got some downsides too. But for me, opening up the kind of reflexive, communicative, verbal communication, emotional domain was super helpful. You know, I did a lot of training in that, and it was very helpful for me. That's something I never would have got from Aikido. I was building a different set of skills, yes, but also a different side of myself. Yeah. Equally, you know, Aikido is mostly about form, particularly in the first 10 years of practice. It tends to think long term in terms of practice. You know, it's, you know, again, in our culture, it seems weird, doesn't it, to say for the first 10 years, or, you know, in meditation, I had a teacher said, just go do that for 3 years, or the Dalai Lama that says, I review my practice regularly every 10 years. Yeah. So this might seem weird in our culture, but practice is a long-term thing that has this thread, this consistency. There's real value in that in our quick fix culture. So anyway, after doing Aikido for 10 years, I realized it was certain things that weren't getting mixed. So I looked at NVC, I looked at Tango. You know, Tango is all about music and connection and relationship and sexiness. And yeah, there's relationship in Aikido. It's quite a lot about that, actually, but not in a sexual way, not in a gendered way, not in an aesthetic way. It doesn't really matter about aesthetics in Aikido. Aesthetics, you know, your throw might look nice, but that's I put this secondary thing that comes from the fact that it's powerful and therefore graceful. Yeah. So to go to a place where people were talking about their shoes, for example, you know, as girls in fabulous high heels, whatever. And I was just like, well, that's just ridiculous. High heels are bad for your posture, you know. But what it opened up to me was the idea of aesthetics, of music, of, you know, you can play with sexuality within Tango in a different way. There isn't really place for in Aikido. I did some contact improv, which took away the sort of martial imperative. It's a lot like Aikido, but it's a form of dance where you're making contact with someone and they're improvising around that. It's a bit like high-level Aikido in some ways, but you're not trying to throw someone. You're not having to sort of keep your head on your hips to avoid falling over. So it frees you in a certain way. Equally, 5 rhythms, was a practice I looked at for, I guess, just freedom, like expressing myself, following myself, going with the flow, the freedom side of things rather than the form side of things. You'll hear me talk about form and freedom quite a lot on these podcasts. And, 5 rhythms really opened up something for me. And I got quite into it. I still practice regularly. I dance with my wife. It's a nice practice to just not have there is a discipline to it, and 5 rhythms people will really argue that. But mostly what it is going with the discipline of just following the sensation, following what wants to happen in your body. So there's some of the practices I've been involved. There's been others. I did mixed martial arts for a year, kind of cage fighting, practicing intensity, practicing courage, really going into the yang side of things. I've done some really yin practices like Gaga dance. What else? Oh, cold approach. So I'm going to scare you all off with this because pickup has a very bad reputation. But for about a year, I would go up to people just in the street and say, "Hi, you look nice. I'd like to talk to you. My name's Mark." Very straightforward. You could call it, I don't know the word seduction. It makes it sound like someone in a velvet jacket. But talking to beautiful women with that I found attractive with a sexual intent. That was a practice for me for some time. Massive practice. You can gain a lot from that in terms of sort of being sensitive to people, in terms of bravery, if nothing else, in terms of social skills, in terms of what we call banter in England, like just being conversational, being improvisational. I've done some improvisational comedy as a practice. And again, it's a different set of skills there that you can build up through doing that. So they're some of the things I've done as practice. At the moment, I use a lot of embodied yoga principles. I haven't talked about that much in the podcast, but this is a system where you build a particular way of being through a very specific posture. What I found was all these things, whether it is martial arts or dance or whatever, were not very efficient in building a quality of being in yourself. They had a lot of baggage, a lot of sort of side stuff happening. Whereas an EYP posture, I can say to my wife, what 3 EYP postures should I be practicing? And she might say openness, letting go, and vulnerability. And that's what she did say, actually, I think. And I was like, okay, I've got 3 specific things to practice based on that, for 1 minute a day, perhaps each. So it's very popular with my corporate clients. I remember there was one person I was coaching from a Swedish furniture manufacturer, let's say, and she was having issues with the board, and she was having issues with authority. She was quite short. She needed to take up more space and be seen more. So I said, right, you can do this is authority posture. This is being seen. This is taking up space. What was the other one I gave her? This is entering in, I think. So I gave her 3 or 4 postures, and for a very busy person to do them for 1 minute a day, that was really realistic for her as a sort of board level executive. And she really liked those, and she got a lot from them. And she was, after a couple of months of doing them, she was like, wow, this is really making a difference. Typically, we see that in the first month, it's hard work. There might be sometimes like an initial love affair if you're really ready for a practice, but more often than not, there's a resistance. Like, I don't like it. It doesn't feel comfortable. It's like new shoes that you have to wear in. And often we'll see that with people. This is, there's sometimes that initial enthusiasm, then that kicks in. It's kind of like January, like, yay, let's go to the gym. February, you're like, oh, God, do I have to go? That's where you need a gym buddy or a personal trainer, right? That's the dip, as it's sometimes called. I think Seth Godin talks about this, Sethgodin, the dip, where you want to quit. And it's like, that's the point where you're not really seeing the benefits of the practice, but you've after the honeymoon period and it started as work. We see this time and time again on EFC, but people are committed, they have peer support, etc., etc., etc. In terms of picking a practice, we've been working for years on this. Like, what do you do? Well, it could be intuitive. It could be just sort of neurosis driven. You get more and more into your thing. Like, I've seen more and more, like in yoga, particularly sort of Iyengar yoga, people get more and more just uptight, more and more controlling in terms of their being. They should go dance rather than do this controlling kind of yoga. Whereas for other people, that would be perfect. So I remember going to a major yoga studio in London. I think I talked about this in another podcast, where there was, I think it was an Ashtanga class followed by a Yin class. And all these people came into a Ashtanga class, maybe in hot yoga actually, and they were kind of super. What I remember is they were like real London people, where I live in Brighton is a bit more chilled out. Think Santa Cruz compared to New York or somewhere, right? And and they came in and they're like, right, ready for their driven yang practice. And I went to yin class, and it's full of these soft, open, relaxed people, before the class. And I thought, God, you guys should swap. You're going to the wrong classes. So certainly getting intentional about this is helpful. Again, we start students with what do you want to build? And it could be a particular quality like courage. It could be something much more specific like being seen while being humorous. Or it could be, we work with 4 elements model. I'll do another podcast on that another time. It might be earth, which is a kind of metaphor for a set of characteristics that might, it makes sense if you say one of the reasons we use 4 elements is fairly intuitive. If I say being earthy, you kind of get what I mean, right? So, the idea of being earthy or being a practice that would make more watery. For example, let's say yoga, earthy yoga might be Iyengar, a watery yoga might be something like Scaravelli, air yoga might be something like acro yoga, kind of fun, spontaneous, creative, and fire might be, the hot yoga, the Ashtanga yoga, the power yoga, the rocket yoga, that kind of thing. So the kind of yoga you pick, and that's just using yoga as an example, we could be working with dance styles or martial arts styles here, is going to depend upon that. If we look at the martial arts, well, karate is sort of earth and fire often, depends on the style, depends on the club, depends on the teacher. This is where it gets complicated. But those, karate is going to build a different well-being. So capoeira, which is much more playful, generally much more social as well, has music in it, has Brazilian cultural influence rather than Japanese cultural influence. The culture of the practice, literally and more figuratively, metaphorically, is important here too. So, other martial arts are, there's Sistema, Russian martial arts, where, it's more about sensitivity and listening, go with the flow. Aikido looks very fluid, but it really depends on the style, so you've got to be a bit careful with that one. I had a student who took up Kendo. She kind of lacked confidence and fierceness, and she took up Kendo, which is like hitting people to stick, like hitting people to stick. She loved it, and she absolutely got into that, and it built a whole new side of her character through doing that. I've had a couple of yoga teacher students who've also done martial arts. One did traditional karate, she was a bit airy, so we gave her traditional karate to do after a lot of discussion and checking out teachers. And the other one did kickboxing, like modern kickboxing. She just needed to be a bit more fiery. And both of them, it built a whole side to their practice, which came out both of them said, one said, in my parenting, it came out. In the other one, as a mindfulness teacher, in her mindfulness teaching, it came out. So it comes out in different ways. And that's how you know that a practice is succeeding, because people say, something's going on here, you're changing, you seem softer is one I had a while back. Instantly, it's usually the thing that's being built, but sometimes it's a reaction to the thing. So one of the times when people told me I was softer was when I was doing loads of cage fighting, and that was just because I was going fully to that yang extreme every single day and then coming back to the yin. The danger, of course, is while you're using that as a kind of regulatory mechanism, you're actually building a more yang way of being. So that's what you've got to be careful of here. Like people that say they're practicing catharsis, and they're just practicing being more and more angry all the time. So you've got to be careful with that. It's also how you do it. So it's not what you do, it's how that you do it. Sorry about the singing. So this is a key principle here, is you could do, let's say your practice like metta, loving kindness meditation, but every day you did it and you're like, I've got to do it, I'm so stupid, I'm rubbish at it, and you're just like hating yourself while you did it, Or let's say you were trying to do something spontaneous and creative, but you did it at Tuesday at 4 p.m. every week, exactly, without fail. It's how you do it. It's not just what you do. So that's some people say to me, is swimming a very watery practice? I'll say, well, it depends how you do it. Are you, racing against someone? Running, one of my colleagues, Alexandra Voskaya, picked up sprinting as her practice. That was her practice for getting some energy and driving forward. But are you just splashing around in the pool? Are you going with friends? It's a very social, connected practice. Are you kind of practicing your stroke in a very formal, structured kind of way? So it is also how you do it, where you do it, who you do it with, particularly the how. So the what and the how are worth examining. So just reflect on that for a moment while I sip some water in terms of your own practice. How do you do it? Okay, let me give a few more examples. Mentioned the yoga teachers doing martial arts. We've also had martial arts teachers doing salsa, for example. Learning to sort of go with the flow, be a bit more relational. That's a key one. Had a number of very sort of fast people take up Tai Chi as a practice, as a way of getting a bit more slow and structured and down to earth. Probably be good for me by the speed that I speak at, right? And one really nice one was a Romanian guy. I'll say his name because he's given me the okay to talk about him personally. Ovidiu. He was a tech guy from Romania, kind of geeky plus Romanian. So I think East European kind of, they're not Slavic, but sort of Slavic type vibe. And he said, I want to be more expressive. This is really hurting my relationship with my wife and my kids. I want to be more expressive emotionally. He says, I feel emotion deeply, but I want to express it. And we gave him the practice every day. He found it very difficult to get to an improv class. We went to a few to kickstart him, but his practice every day was reading poetry. He'd have to read a love poem to his wife and a comedy poem to his children every single day to build the different emotions. And he could move around different types of poems. But they were the two main sets of kind of emotional expression he wanted to work with, the comedy and the sensual. And they absolutely loved it. So, of course, they supported him. They would, the children would be knocking on his door saying, Daddy, it's time to read the poem, and he'd be like, even when he didn't want to practice, he had that reminder system. Reminder systems are very helpful in terms of behavioral change. Motivation system, they cared about his kids, obviously, and they were there intrusively reminding him on a daily basis to do it, which I thought was great. And he's, was a big success in terms of the practice that he did. I mean, we've had people do everything over the years. I mean, let me think. What have we had? I'd love to maybe I'll get you a list sometime, but we have some treadmill. We've had every kind of dance you could imagine. Jazz dance, tap dance. We've had every kind of martial arts you could imagine, from Taekwondo to Aikido to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to Chinese Wushu, everything. We've had people do, what else? Weights even, but doing weights in an embodied way. So with awareness, with building a particular quality of being. God, my mind's going blank now, but we've certainly had acro yoga. It's been a popular one for some. There's been so many over the years. There are a few practices that you could look at, and again, looking at what it builds as the key thing. Okay, I've got another mastery quote from Mr. Leonard here. Learning any new skill involves relatively brief spurts of progress, each which is followed by a slight decline to a plateau somewhat higher in most cases than that which preceded it. So that's interesting, because it's like the idea of sometimes we get worse before we get better. He continues, the upward spurts vary, the plateaus have their own dips and rises along the way. To take the master's journey, you have to practice diligently, striving to hone your skills to attain new levels of competence. But while doing so, and this is the inexorable fact of the journey, you'll also have to be willing to spend most of your time on a plateau to keep practicing even when you seem to be getting nowhere. It's not very sexy, is it? It's not very appealing to the modern mind in some ways, It's just like, I remember I was at a Zen school and they said, look, it's on a retreat with them, Jumbo, and he said, look, if you want to practice with us, the deal is 1 hour a day. We don't care when you do it. You can split it into 2 half hours or whatever you want, but that's what it takes if you want to be part of our community. I was like, wow, it's strong. It's strong to tell people an hour a day, but respect for that. So what we can expect along this journey certainly is resistance. So I was just reading Stephen Pressfield's The War of Art. Stephen Pressfield, I highly recommend that book. He talks all about resistance almost as the devil, he frames it. He's an artistic guy. He's an ex-military guy. He frames it almost like a battle, hence the name. It's a really great framing, actually. I really like how he frames it. There's other frames we can talk about in the dance or other things. The key thing here, one of my students said this today on Facebook when I was talking about doing this podcast, is the mixture between pragmatism and realism, or mixture of personal responsibility and situation, agent and victimhood. So shit happens, right? Stuff happens in our life and we don't go to practice. We feel tired. This week I had a pretty good week. My primary practice is yoga at the moment. I made 4 classes this week, a little bit of personal practice. That's my main body practice at the moment. I may well go to Aikido on Sunday. I went dancing as well. So it's a pretty good practice week for me this week. It doesn't always work that well. If I'm traveling, it's harder. It's one reason I switched to yoga, actually, is because you can do it in a hotel room, moderating one's practice. I used to do Aikido much more. That was my primary practice, and it was so hard, and you can do it on your own. I learned to sort of do Aikido with trees and do weapons practice and do the sort of turns and stretches and things. I used to do that on my own diligently in the woods when I was working off in the woods away from an Aikido club. But It's certainly much easier to do yoga in a hotel room. It's much more portable. So lifestyle is a factor here. You know, there's one of my students who's doing Feldenkrais lessons as their practice. The beautiful thing about Feldenkrais lessons is you can do it from the internet, free of charge. They don't cost anything to download, and the instruction method is entirely verbal, so that's actually as good, or nearly as good, as going to a club. You don't get the same thing as, you know, being in a class, the social support, or the one time in the class where you go, what the hell is happening, and look at the teacher. But generally the method is as good verbally, and because of her lifestyle, that was, you know, the practice for her, that she was wanting to build slowing down and feeling her body. Well, Feldenkrais is great for slowing down. If you don't know it, check it out. Look up awareness through movement. It's loads of great podcasts. Let me, in fact, tell you who I recommend. It's somebody who's on iTunes that also has a really good podcast. It's the British Feldenkrais Guild. They're very good. And I listen to this person regularly, but I never catch their name. It is Annie Thoe, Thoe, Annie Thoe. She's someone I'd really recommend if you want to download all her podcasts. Also, Scott Clark, his exactly how it's said, his podcasts are very good on Feldenkrais and iTunes packages. So that's a practice that absolutely suited her because of her lifestyle. Yeah. So this does depend on, you know, physicality. I've had some clients and have been just physically in a way where some practices would be just far too difficult for them, while others would be much more accessible. You know, again, it depends on the teacher. A considerate Aikido teacher can hopefully take students up to the age of 70 or 80 without any problems, 90 even. But, you know, if the teacher isn't considerate or isn't skilled with older people, they could just be plain dangerous. So, yeah, practical matters to consider here. So when, you know, this resistance come up, when are we flexible? When do we go with the flow? When do we give ourselves a break, you know, have a sleep in? I did that the other day. It was just like, you know what, I'm a human being. I'm not going to get up and do yoga at 7 a.m. I'm going to have a sleep in. And when do we actually go, no, discipline, sticking with it, taking responsibility, not being a victim, and actually saying, no, this is something I'm gonna continue with to develop my own non-accidental life. You know, we can tweak our practice as well in terms of like the club we'd go to or the thing we're working on. As I said, like through Aikido now, that's just, you know, it's a vehicle for me to practice so much now. At a certain level, that becomes easier with any practice to be using as a vehicle. In terms of what do you do when there's resistance? Well, hopefully you've already made a commitment. If you're already doing it with a group of people you're committed to, if you're teaching classes, it's certainly hard to get out of. That can be very helpful. When to take a step back, when to take a step forward. This is really the art. When to get a coach to encourage you, and when sometimes to quit. You know, I had a year off Aikido and it was a really worthwhile thing to do. I felt almost enslaved by it. And then when I came back to it, I wanted to do it. It was from the joy, not from some sense of obligation. Sometimes really just changing course and saying, you know what, it takes courage, you know, to say, you know, I've done yoga for 20 years, but actually I'm going to learn to dance. That's going to be way better for me. Whether intuitively from the heart drawn to that, or you've just worked it out, like this is going to build a better way of being that's more useful for me, then yeah, you know, that's a brave move to change course in that way. And I'd ask you to reflect listening to this. Do you need to tweak your practice? How are you dealing with resistance? You know, how is that showing up? Is it boredom? Is it, you know, the infatuation with something new? Often I have students that are really into what I do, and then something else really sexy, and then it'd be this like new best friend, you know? Do you have that kind of a pattern? Is it that you just feel very safe? You know, some people get very safe in a practice and it just feels easy. You know, I had this the other day. I was having kind of a bad day and I had a choice between a kind of modern dance class that I thought I was going to go to. I told myself, right, you can go to this today, something new. And then I just went, no, I can't do it. I need something safer today. So if that's a key pattern in your life, you're going to stick with what you know, which is not necessarily bad, but, you know, can be limiting. For me, it was just a sort of daily thing, but it could be, you know, if that was happening again and again and again, I'd probably stop pushing my edges in the same way that I like to try new things. My personal strategy is to do several things ongoing for the rest of my life, yoga, Aikido, and meditation being the main ones. So up and down the sort of levels of those things, and really committing for life for those things, kind of like a marriage, you know, till death does us part. And you know, didn't do that lightly. But also, there's a possibility of divorce from those things permanently. As I said, but I took a year out, but generally it's a lifelong commitment. And I major in something every year. So, I spent a year doing the MMA, a year doing yoga, a year doing conscious dance, a year doing tango, a year doing the cold approach. And this year it's Alexander Technique and Feldenkrais. And over a year, really hammering some hours with something. Because the thing with practice is in a year you can learn a lot, especially if it's a year of sort of on average, kind of let's say 5 to 10 hours a week. If you're a embodied professional, that's doable. If you've got another job and another hobby, you might just be a couple of hours a week. But I'd say, a good commitment would be like 3 classes a week. At 2, you can kind of get some improvement. 4 or 5 might be too many for most people. 1, I think, so like for keto at the moment, I just do 1 every kind of couple of weeks or something. That's okay for maintenance if you've got a good basis of practice already, but you're not going to be deepening much in that. So 2 or 3 times a week is kind of a good aim, I would say. And more if you're an embodied professional like myself and you want to really go into something. But in a year, you can learn a lot. The learning curve slows down. So a lot of the learning of a practice is in the first year in terms of the amount of learning, but in terms of the depth of learning, it's over 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. So that's why I think it's important to have some marriages, as it were, some lifelong commitments. And as I said, the resistance will show up in all kinds of ways. The sexy new thing, boredom, being scared of something, interpersonal conflicts. That's a classic. Suddenly like disliking the teacher. And obviously the teacher needs to be good enough and, ethical and not abusing anyone. But assuming that's the case, what you'll find is their personality will sooner or later rub up against you. Again, like in a relationship, the personality will rub up against you. And if you just walk away at that point, well, you've missed out on a lot. Everyone's going to annoy you. I notice this with podcasts. So I'll listen to a podcast for a while. I'll be listening to, Jordan Peterson or Liberated Body. I'm looking at my phone now, The New Man. I'm looking at my podcast here, my Russian podcast, Waking Up with Sam Harris, Bliss and Grit. These are the podcasts, Joe Rogan, Tom Toreo, Feldenkrais Guild, Against the Stream. So these are some of the podcasts I'm listening to. And what I notice is after, say, 10 podcasts, I start to get annoyed with their voice. And some people are more annoying than others. Some people have something in their voice that really grates on me, something in their embodiment doesn't fit with mine. But even the nicest people, let's take Brooke Thomas, who's absolutely lovely, who interviewed me from Liberated Body. Great podcast if you haven't checked it out yet. Liberated Body podcast. Even after like 30 of her podcasts, I'm like, yeah, something slightly going on there. Yeah. And that's in me, right? That's not her. So this is why, sticking with, and that's just from a voice. So let alone if someone's throwing you around or dancing tango with you, practices will force us to confront ourselves. They will bring out our shadow. Long term, if you stay in a practice for long enough, it will force you to confront parts of yourself that you don't want to see. And that's when it's easy to quit as well. So maybe it's boredom, maybe it's relationship problems, maybe it's the exciting new thing, what else? Maybe it's like getting really obsessive about a practice. That can be a funny way in which practices can do us harm, actually start to sort of become so obsessive that they harm the rest of our life. I've certainly gone through periods where I was doing so much Aikido that, my relationship suffered, or so much MMA that my work suffered, staying up late dancing tango. Tango milongas, dancers tend to be till quite late at night, and it was becoming a real problem, and they talk about tango divorces and Aikido divorces. I mean, you've got to be careful with practices. That's what I'd say as well. Like anything with careful not to quit, but also careful if they don't get you, to the expense of everything else in your life. Because a practice like tango or Aikido or whatever it is, yoga, they have depth, they have substance. And when you start mining the real depth of it after a year or 5 years or 10 years, that's the point where you can go, you know what, the rest of life just looks dull by comparison. The rest of life looks like, why would I bother? Why would I bother? So that's another danger of practice, actually, is the sort of obsessive quality. Sometimes people just forget they're practicing. So they're doing something like Aikido or whatever it is. I keep using that as an example because it was my first love, as it were. And they forget. And they don't know why they're there. And they've just got caught by the technique. They're obsessed about the latest jiu-jitsu arm lock or obsessed about the latest tango twirl or whatever it is, and they've lost the point of why they were doing it in the first place. Because at the end of the day, who cares if you can throw someone? I mean, assuming you're not like a bouncer or something, who cares if you can dance a tango move? It's not your job, it's whatever. No one's gonna love you anymore, or when you die, say, well, at least they had a good wrist lock. So to get caught in technique, the trap of technique, and to get more and more obsessed with this sort of reduced learning curve of getting purer and purer and purer, the perfect Aikido technique doesn't happen. And about once a year, I do a good throw. Even when I was practicing loads, once a year, you go, wow, it's really good. And you try and replicate it. Of course, you can't. And that glimpse at the transcendent in practice means that you can just obsess about them forever, because there's something real within that. So yeah, there's some of the ways resistance comes up. I know I'm missing more. Have a think for a moment. What have I seen over the years? What have I seen? Life just getting in the way is the big one, isn't it? So it's to keep coming back to it, to keep coming back to why you do it, the aim, but also the love of it. I think I've seen this with students again. Sometimes they say, should I do this practice? Should I do that? And on one level, it really matters. I say, look, it really matters what you're building. But on another level, any practice is good because it's building discipline, you're showing up, you're working on yourself. Any practice sooner or later, let's say I said Aikido is not about aesthetics. Well, in a kind of funny way it is. You'll get to aesthetics eventually through Aikido. It's just not particularly suggested in the same way as in Tango. In the same way as, conflict might not be the primary heart of Tango, but you hang around Tango people long enough, you'll have some conflicts to deal with, trust me, yeah? A really cool thing can be to look at what a practice has built in a community. So I had a stall to promote some of my work at a craniosacral therapy conference. It's a very delicate, beautiful form of bodywork. And not long before I was due to do that, my dad passed away. And I thought, God, should I be doing this? I don't really want to be in public. Maybe I should just be privately grieving. But I got the table and I paid for it. And I was like, well, I'll just leave some flyers out. And I went to the conference and I thought, I'll just leave my banners up and my flyers out and email sign up, And what I realised was this conference is full of the most delicate, considerate people I'd ever fucking met. And I was like, whoa, okay. And I stayed there for 2 days, and it was a really great environment to be in because their practice had built that. Yeah. In the same way as when I'm with martial artists, there's sort of a robustness around conversation that isn't the way when I went to the yoga communities and really stumbled across some things. And I was like, whoa, okay, sorry, oops. Because I was used to martial arts people. There was a certain body that had been built in that practice, So when you're around a club, or even better, like a summer school or an intensive or a conference or something like that, when a get together, what's the group body that's been built? Now, obviously, there's something about cause and effect here in terms of who's attracted to the practice in the first place. However, I've just seen too many people change. We see this every year on EFC. A practice changes people. They come in and they look different. After 2 months, sometimes 4 months, almost definitely 6 months, everyone looks different. The before and after photos are really quite something. If we look at the photo at the beginning of the course and the end of the course, people look different. On video, they sound different. They come across different. And again, they say, someone once said to me, my wife likes your course. I didn't quite know what he meant, but something that was being built in him, I think it was a kind of fiery yangness that was appreciated by his wife. He was referring to, to say, look, she's picked up on this. Equally, though, families can be part of that resistance. We are, George Leonard speaks about this actually, homeostatic systems. We're systems that want to stay put in place because that we're essentially conservative on the neurological level, but also in terms of social systems. So someone might say, of course, honey, I want you to become better at saying no. And they go and they learn saying no, and they build the boundaries, and they practice every day doing push-ups with saying no and doing no posture from EYP and doing karate or whatever it is. And then after a while, their husband or wife really starts pushing back and being like, well, I don't like this. You're saying no too often now. I liked it when you said yes. That's why I married you. And it's often unconscious. So it's really important we get the buy-in of our, close friends, loved ones, at least making that as conscious as possible, because systems try to stay in place. And often we've outsourced bits of ourselves to someone. Let's say, take the example of being yin or yang, and the atrophies in ourselves. Let's say I'm very yang, my wife's more yin. It's like, okay, she could atrophy in that yang capacity if she's letting me do it all the time, and I could atrophy in the yin capacity. It's like the corporate example is outsourcing. Yeah, you forget to do something once you've let someone else do it. You lose that skill. That's a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. But also, that person doesn't like you taking their job, so they're like, well, come on, I'm the yang one. How dare you? What are you doing? And even if they say they do, often that's tricky. We actually warn warn people at the start of EFC. We say, look, this could ruin your relationships. This could really damage your relationships. You need to talk to your partner, then tell them you're on a transformational course, and it's about you changing as a person. That's what a practice does. So of course we're homeostatic. Of course we have resistances to practice on the way, and it's the long-term journey that really matters here. Alrighty, so what have I talked about there? Resistances to practice. Yeah, maybe have it just to reflect for a moment. How does resistance show up for you? If you have a practice, how does resistance show up for you? In what form? Great. I'm aware that I speak quite quickly, so on these podcasts I'm going to do these little pauses. Gives me a break, gives you a break, and allows you to think for a minute, you know? I don't have to speak every moment. We can have periods of silence, like friends that can be comfortable with each other. That'll be a more sane way to do this. I'm learning how to do podcasts, so bear with me, and do give me the feedback on the Facebook group. This becomes a practice for me, actually, in its own right. Alrighty, so time to look at your own practice. Yeah, I invite you all to examine your practice. What is your practice? If you don't have one, how could you pick one? Well, again, starting with the aim, you might want to look around, try some things, go to a few different clubs or a few different yoga studios, whatever it is. But start with that aim. What do you want to build? And being careful of the how you're doing it as well as what you're doing. It might be worth reflecting on this. So sit down with a friend and go, well, I've been doing, Ashtanga yoga every morning for the last 10 years. And I've got very good at this. I know Ashtanga yogis are often quite fiery, I've found. But, however, I might want to be a bit more flexible, a bit more, not just physically flexible, but a bit more open, perhaps. I'm going to start doing some yin yoga. And I'm going to find a couple of clubs to do that. And I'm going to be very open to the teacher and the community and the people there and do that, for example. You could look at the hours you're doing, So we don't want to get too mechanistic about this, but there is something about tracking. Okay, am I actually doing this regularly enough to make a difference? Yeah, am I hitting those sort of minimum of 2 or 3 times a week? Look at your calendar, get your calendar out. How many times have you done it? Not theoretically, but in the last month, actually, or the last 3 months, if you want to. So actually looking at the hours. Also, is there the reflective period? Is there the feedback? Is there the community around it? Could you improve the space of your practice? Yeah. I hope, if nothing else, this podcast makes you think about your practices. If you don't have a practice, I would say it's very difficult to make progress in the sort of embodiment world in terms of developing in this way. If you just sort of accidentally come across this podcast, well, welcome to the adventure, welcome to the non-accidental life. Could be something for the podcast, couldn't it? The non-accidental life, I like that. And welcome and pick something. In a way, go with something. If it's your first thing, go with something you enjoy. Where there's love, people will continue. And this is the train of thought I cut myself off from earlier. If someone's too hard on themselves about their practice, it won't continue. Yeah, if there's no love there, yes, it might be something there's a bit of resistance to at first as you try and build that body, as you try to get comfortable in the new shoes. However, if you don't have love for it at least a little bit after a kind of a couple of months of doing something, I'd change to something else. There needs to be at least the possibility. I remember when I first did Aikido, I fell in love with it mentally very quickly. I like the look of it, but actually classes I really struggled with for a long time. It was about a year till I started really loving it. I think it's why so many people quit. I started with 100 people on Freshers Week at university. It's like you try all these different things. And there was 2 of us left by the end of the first year, and only myself by the end of the 3 years. My mate Chris, he did a couple of years, but he's a good guy and he got a lot from it. Maybe that's all he needed, but it was very interesting, the dropout rate. And I think because it was such a slow learning curve. But yeah, for me, I could at least see the possibility of loving it. It's like sometimes it's like an arranged marriage, but even arranged marriages, the people that do that are smart. They have these matchmaking people in Indian communities in the UK, for example, and they're smart in how they do it. And there needs to be at least the possibility that 2 people will love each other, and often they do, surprisingly. So you can think of it as a sort of as a falling in love at first sight, or it can be a bit of an arranged marriage, but there needs to be that possibility of love for it, to find where. And often I say to my students, where's the pleasure in this? Where's the fun in this? Has something taken over? It's become too much of a chore. Yes, our practices are about developing ourselves as people, and that's very noble and important. And if we don't do that, we're screwed, because if we don't do that, we'll go to the lowest common denominator of society and our own baggage. So it's not a small thing. It's not a small thing to develop yourself, to have the courage to do this. I could criticize anyone's practice to say, well, it's maybe not the practice for them, whatever. But seriously, God, I'm choking up a little bit here. If you do a practice at all, credit to you, power to you, whatever you fucking do. It's a noble endeavor, dare I say that, in our cynical world. It's a noble endeavor to go to yoga or aikido or tango to develop yourself with that intention. That's a big thing. So on one level, whatever we're doing is fine. They're all embodied practices if you're practicing basic body awareness. Everything else on top of that's kind of a bonus, isn't it? And, for the more sophisticated among you that haven't just stumbled across it, if you stumbled across it, great, just do anything. For the more sophisticated, you might look at, okay, what are the actual skills I want? What are the different ways of being? How long have I been doing this? Am I quitting too early? Am I not quitting too late? Am I in an abusive relationship? People get so invested in their practices because you get very good at something. And when I go to Aikido, I look reasonably good at what I'm doing, and people give me kudos, and the beginners want to learn from me, and the teachers there respect me. I'm like the senior student at my club. I'm very invested in that, and it takes a lot of humility to go to a new class of, say, I don't know, let's say starting up jazz dance and be a complete idiot, at that. And, every year I like to do something fresh just to keep me in the mindset that I ask my students to do, of doing something fresh when they come on EFC, to realize what it's like to be a beginner and how much courage that takes. So we can become way too invested in our practice. It can become like an identity level thing, like I am a yogi and I'm very spiritual, or I am a tough Japanese martial artist. It's a little bit silly, it's a little bit silly. So going to something completely different where your ego's not there and people don't know who the hell you are. For the more senior people out there, which I know is a lot of the listeners, actually, people that have 20, 30 years behind them in a practice, that can certainly be very helpful too, to develop that humility and at least do a bit of cross-training, I don't regret the year I did in mixed martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for my Aikido. I hadn't done tango in years, but the other night I was in Russia. There was like a music thing came on as part of a talent show we were doing. Someone started dancing tango. And I was so happy that I could turn to my business partner, Vilja, we'll get her on the show, actually. She's brilliant. And, ask her to dance. Even though I hadn't danced in years, I was so glad I was able to connect with her in that way. She's a tango teacher and I knew she'd love it. And it was brilliant. It was a really touching moment between us. So you won't regret cross-training, and if anything else, it will enrich your primary practice. So that's another way of thinking about it. If you're a senior, take a good solid year doing something else, and maybe don't stop your main practice completely, but just do it for a little bit. A year isn't so long. A year isn't so long. If you did a year, 10 things for a year, which I'm getting to the point now, I've almost done that. It's almost been 10 years of focusing on things. And it builds this just rich variety of things. And it's, if I'm in Aikido now, I'm sort of doing body work as I put an arm lock on. And that comes from having extended practice into sort of body work and healing arts, for example. I'm much more creative in it because of the improv. I'm aware of different dynamics because of the social stuff. So even if you were just trying to improve your primary art and you'd been you're dedicated to that, I'd say there's benefit to cross-training for the more experienced people here. But this is something we can chat about in the Facebook group as well. You can say to me, what is a practice for X? And I'll probably say, well, it depends who you're with and who the teacher is and how you do it. But you people can still make some good suggestions. I am trying to build this. What could I do? Or we can start with the art and say, what? For some reason, I really like, I don't know, let's pick something random, ballet. Yeah, I really like ballet. There's an adult ballet class in my neighborhood. What could I build through that? And we might say, oh, great. You could build like discipline or precision or grace or elegance, or there's so many things you could build within that. It's not true. Or you could ask me on the group, give me an EYP posture, and we've got videos of pictures of most of the postures. Give me a posture for X, Y, or Z. Give me a posture for taking up space. Give me a posture for humility. Give me a posture for letting go. Give me a posture for openness. That's another thing I can help you guys with if you just want a little micro practice there. We've talked about centering before. So centering is a practice in a way. It's more about state, right? So these two episodes, one on centering, one on practice, are complementary. So centering is great for state, but back to the key message here. If we want to change our way of being, if we want to change our long-term disposition, our long-term way of being in the world, then what we need is a practice. So coming up to nearly an hour now. I hope that was useful, educational, interesting. Look forward to seeing your comments on the Facebook group. Subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. It was nice to hang out with you guys. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.